This is my lecture introduction to Aristotle's philosophy, a method of writing, his view of the human being in the universe, and an introduction to the ethics. So if you have the notes in front of you, you should have two documents in front of you. The one is my notes on this lecture, and the other one is a little diagram of the cone. The cone! I have to say that I've been teaching this material ever since I was a professor. And, of course, I had several courses in graduate school on this material and first read it as an undergraduate. And I can claim some credit that this idea of portraying Aristotle's idea of the universe and human beings in it is actually mine. I as a teacher, I've always struggled not only to understand the stuff myself, which I've still struggle with it, but I've tried to make it intelligible to students. So this idea of portraying the Aristotelian universe as a cone, and this is critical when we come to it, human beings as a cone within that cone, at the same time the tip of the cone. I think that will help to understand Aristotle's rather complex view of this universe and our place in it and what we are in it. Anyway, so let's talk first about his view of the universe, which I just mentioned, and the core concepts, purpose, nature, and the four causes. Then I want to raise a question of, obviously, you now have read a selection from Plato's Republic, and here's Aristotle's Ethics. And you can tell that this is a quite different mode of writing. Some people love Plato, hate Aristotle, and I actually love Aristotle, and maybe that explains to you my dating life. I don't know. I'm sorry, I once went on a date with and then she said, "What do you like to do in your spare time? What do you do for fun?" And I said, "Oh, I love to read Aristotle." That was our last date. Anyway, then I want to talk about the ethics and introduce you to books 1 through 4 of the ethics, because the more astute of you would have noticed that book 5 is the 5th book of the ethics. Chapters are books. Each book is divided into chapters, and so in my discussion of the ethics is to give you an introduction to that work and to show you how Aristotle's discussion of justice fits in with that. So let's start with what I call the external landscape of human life and consciousness, and that is his view of the universe that we live in, and how to understand it. Is it possible to understand it, and what method and what concepts are necessary to understand it? All right. So Aristotle's view of the universe is a doctrine of nature. That is to say, the way the external world is created and the way that our being is created by nature. And Aristotle is quite aware of the fact, as Socrates was and Plato and you and I, that you and I are mixtures of both things by nature, that is to say, a principle of causality of the universe at large, and culture or artificial stuff. I mean, you have a name, you wear clothes, much nicer than the ones I do, and obviously a good portion of who and what you are is a result of the culture that you live in, including things like morality and concepts of right and wrong, but also just your very identity, the idea of having a name, and so even if you and I are a mixture of something called nature and something called convention, the key to understanding ourselves as beings in the universe is to understand the nature of the universe, which means what's nature, but then also the individual nature of a thing. And Aristotle begins to understand nature by virtue of what he calls the four causes that can bring something into a being or explain its being. Now, in modern science tends to be what's called reductivist or reductionist and materialist. That you don't understand a thing's nature until you understand the way that the chemicals and the atoms inside of it move and compose it. You could say that the totality of natural explanation of the universe in the modern science is chemistry. I should say biology, which is ultimately a form of chemistry, which is ultimately a form of physics, and ultimately takes us back to the Higgs boson. Anyway, Aristotle also views the world as a combination of material forces. And you're going to see these four causes means the forces that bring something into being that explain its existence. And you need all four of these to understand what something is and how it exists. The material cause is something is made of. The formal cause is the shape, form, or blueprint of that thing, like DNA in human beings. And I'll use an artificial thing, a chair. Come back to this in a minute. The efficient cause is the force that actually brings together the material and form to embody and last the final or purpose of the thing. Yes, Aristotle's doctrine is called teleological. He argues that not only can you measure natural motion and understand it and weigh it and that kind of stuff, the physical properties of things, but you can also look at the form, the process by which it's brought into being, and ultimately, yes, Aristotle says there are purposes in nature. Now, this is a big question, and you could say that's what's on the one side of Plato and Aristotle, and on the other hand, Descartes, and even Darwin. But at least let me try to make Aristotle's notion intelligible to you, and then we'll press on. So take a chair. A chair. The material cause of a chair is wood. It can also be other materials, by the way, as long as the material is consistent with the form and the purpose that you want a chair to do. A formal is the blueprint or design of the chair. The efficient cause is the woods person or the crafts person or the factory machine putting the chair together, bringing it into being. And the purpose or final thing is to put yourself on it and sit on it. Now, it's true a chair can be used for other things, but at least you could say, if you want to understand what's a chair, then you'd have to understand that all four of these causes. So what's nature, and what is the nature of a thing? The word nature is a Latin word. It comes from natus, which means to be born. So literally, nature means the way a thing is born or comes into the world, not by artifice or art, or even by divine creation, but rather by the processes of the world around us. The Greek word for nature is physis, and the study of nature, by the way, is physike in Greek, which are physics. So physics doesn't mean material or the study of material things. It can include that because that's part of Aristotle's view of the nature, but literally, it means what a thing is when all of its causes are at an end of growth, completion, and development. So to understand the nature of a thing, whether it's a human being, whether it's a house, and of course a house is an artificial thing, but a dog, or the most common example given is an acorn. If you pick up an acorn and look at it, taste it, chew it, like that little creature in Ice Age that lives to get an acorn, you understand that there is a way in which you can understand what it is. You could take it apart chemically and everything like that. But you also know that the final thing that an acorn is a potential oak tree. And what the nature of the acorn is to grow into an oak tree. And that what you're looking at when you're looking at an acorn is the thing, but it's not. You understand that the thing is not what it is. It still has a process of growth and development, and eventually it will turn into an oak tree. And again, as you're going to see, this is the key to not only Aristotle's natural explanation of the universe, and that's we'll return to the cone in a minute. It's also the explanation of a human being. If you take a 2-year-old child, you know that in some ways every natural being has a certain range of powers and abilities. It has a potential to be something. And so for Aristotle, just to give another definition of what nature is, a thing's nature is what it is when all of its potentials have been turned into actuality. So Aristotle's universe is a universe of potential becoming actualized through motion into development. And so why is that important, and why would that be good to know? Well, if you took an acorn and if you had enough experience of nature and because of reason and reflection, you knew what it could grow into, you also know how to help it grow into that. You know, once you know a thing's nature, in other words, you know what's good and bad for that thing. You know, for instance, that if you put an acorn in a piece of concrete and keep it in a basement, in a lead box, it will not grow into an oak tree. That's not good for those things. But if you give it soil and water, etc. And in an odd way, that's also true of human beings. A human being is a set of potentials. What you are at 2, so let's be clear, what you are at 5 is more than what you were at 2, what you are at 10 is more than what you are at 5, and what you are at 19 is much more than what you were when you were 2. You're a human being all the way, but to understand what a human being is, you have to know what they grow into and what their range of potentials is. And as you're going to see, that's how Aristotle understands what we are as human beings, also what the universe is and our place in it. And so let me explain it by reference to this neat diagram of the cone. Now, first of all, let me tell you why I chose this metaphor. A cone is, if you've had geometry, you know there are different ways to define a circle. Circle is a line drawn from a radius equidistant from a center. Every a straight line is literally a series of points. A plane is two-dimensional lines extended in space, and a three-dimensional space adds a z-axis. A cylinder, if you know, is a circle extended upwards in space. A sphere, for instance, is a circle rotated around a common point, because every point on a sphere is equidistant from its center, just like except a sphere is a 3D circle, kind of. And a cylinder is a circle extended in space vertically. Now, what a cone is a cone is a three-dimensional figure which starts with a large circle at the base and then culminates in a point. And that's critical because you're going to see that Aristotle is going to argue that human beings are unique in the universe. In fact, Aristotle is going to argue that we are the purpose of the universe. We are what the universe wants to be. And how can that be when we're only such a tiny part of the universe? I mean, after all, much more of the universe is composed of hydrogen and gases and department chairs full of gas. Just kidding. I have to get a slight dig in my beloved department chair. Anyway, but note, if you go up in a cone, and if you intersect a cone at any particular time with an intersecting plane, you'll create a circle. That's what I've tried to draw there. What happens to the size of the circle as you move up in the cone and intersect it with planes? There will come a point where the circle will get so small that if you put a plane at the top of the point of the cone, you won't have a circle. Rather, you'll have a plane. You'll have an intersection with the cone that consists of a single point. Now, a single point is only a tiny part of the entire cone. But if you took the point away from the cone, you wouldn't have a cone anymore. So, in an interesting way, that one single point is the outcome of moving up in the cone, because the range of phenomena of the circle that is you have at each place gets smaller and smaller. As you're going to see, the cone is the universe, and what that ranges from is at the base simple matter in motion, and that, of course, that's the vast majority of almost the totality of what consists of the universe. Animate life, which we at this point still only know exists on this planet, and only in certain restaurants on Main Street in Spartanburg. No, the vast material of the universe is, so that means if you did an intersecting cone line at the bottom, the circle would be huge, but it would only have things like chemicals and atoms in it. Now, if you go up, there comes a point where, and this is the first great distinction between what's below it and what's above it, then you'll notice that the first great dividing line is between life and non-life. And Aristotle argues, and I have to say, I've tried to follow biology and evolutionary biology on the origin of life, and I have to say that I can't go into that fully now because again, I'm explaining Aristotle. I don't think we're much further along. We are further along chemically and in terms of physics and in the structure of the atom than Aristotle was. But in terms of explaining what life is, Aristotle defined life as the addition of two motions to simple matter: nutrition, where the internal processes of a living thing absorb stuff from the outside and eat, and all the rest, and reproduction. That's what defines life. And I have to say, if you look at evolutionary biology, they can't make up their minds of what first came was like simple RNA developing out of complex amino acids that finally created DNA and the cell, or was there, which is to say, reproduction came first, or did a cell wall form? Some people argue that there were certain clays that could have formed a cell, and therefore nutrition started. We still don't know that, actually. We still don't know how life originated, and we haven't gone much further than saying that what defines life are those two critical functions. But you have to see that that's one of the great cusps or dividing line. Then, if you continue further up on the cone, getting smaller, then you find the next great distinction between plant and animal life. And what animal life adds to it is locomotion and or sensation. You could say they're the both, because if you're going to move around in the universe, you better be able to see what you're about to knock into. So animals have a new function, two new functions: locomotion, motion, and sensation. Then, as you go up in animal life, notice the cone is getting smaller. Then you notice that there comes a point where animals add certain functions like in addition to sensation, memory, and then imagination, and then ultimately getting very close up, we're in the range somewhere of like dolphins and whales and chimpanzees and orangutans and department chairs or college students. I'm just kidding. And that's judgment, where again you can see the way animals hunt in packs, or you can see cats exercising judgment, but and chimpanzees and higher apes and perhaps the cetacean life may have something close to it. But Aristotle argues you have to go one more step up, and that's where you're at the point. So literally, that's why I think this metaphor helps to understand Aristotle's universe. Literally, when you're at the top of the cone, you're and one point. You only have one point in the entire cone that makes that single point unique. And for that's the power of reason and self-consciousness. Now, I already suggested what reason is according to Plato, and I think Aristotle is the same thing. The capacity to see sameness and difference. We're the only part of that entire universe that actually can see ourselves in the universe, see how we're similar to, we are, after all, part of a cone, but we're also unique and different from everything else in the universe. We're the single point on the cone. And notice it's at the top. And once you get to the top, you're at the end of the cone. That is, in a way, is what Aristotle means by nature as a whole developing up to us, and then our own capacities developing our highest capacity that define us as a human being and a unique part of the universe. And if you look on the diagram over to the right, you'll see every human being is also a cone. Not a cone head, but a cone. Why? Because you and I are composed of the material of the universe. You have calcium, and just like the insides of stars invent in supernovae. And then we also are living. Therefore, we have both nutrition and reproduction. And we're also animals, so we have all that plus locomotion, sensation, and judgment. And then ultimately, Aristotle argued at the top of us, of every human being, is that capacity for reason. So developing that capacity for rational self-consciousness is why we're the only part of the universe that's actually part of the universe and yet free of it at the same time. Our capacity for rational self-consciousness is what gives us the ability to see ourselves in the universe and everything, but also to see the other parts of ourselves so that we can actually bring rational self-rule. As you're going to see, that's the key to what Aristotle understands what philosophy is, just like Plato. And overlapping with Plato, what philosophic self-consciousness does is allow you to understand and see the inner landscape, we'll come to that in a minute, so that you can actually be the freest and most dignified. So for Aristotle, his moral theory will argue you can't have morality without choice and freedom. Otherwise, you can't blame people for what they do or hold them responsible. So in order to, because morality means right and wrong and holding people responsible, and if you're not free, then you're not responsible for your actions. Only a free being can be held responsible for its actions. And then the question is, what generates that pocket of freedom within the universe and within us? It's that power of reason. And therefore, moral life means being able to bring the irrational and other elements of your soul, your character, under rational self-awareness and guidance. What the meaning of the moral life is we'll come to, but at least that's an introduction to his universe. So let's talk about the different kinds of writing. You notice that Aristotle's writing is very different from Plato's. Plato writes, again, these 34 dialogues that are like little plays, and you kind of have to, like a Shakespearean play, as I mentioned, you have to, in my lecture on Plato, you've got to interpret and that kind of stuff. Aristotle's writing is very straightforward. It's like a manual. It's called a treatise. It tells you, it defines what it is, and it's not bad. It's not inaccurate to say the ethics and the politics that follows it is the first great self-help manual, not owing its teaching and content to divine revelation or sacred texts. Aristotle, like Plato, like Socrates, argue the task of a human being is to use our natural powers of observation and choice and self-scrutiny to actually understand ourselves and chart our path in the universe. That's the point of human life. But let's talk about the writing. So Plato wrote complex dialogues, and Aristotle writes these interesting, somewhat boring, but more perhaps useful treatises. Note, both Aristotle and Aristotle was Plato's student. He came to the Lyceum. He came to the Academy as a young man and studied, we think, about 20 years with Plato, and then went on to form his own school called the Academy, the Lyceum, also in Athens. And remember, Plato. So about writing versus talking. Remember what happened to Socrates? He went on asking everybody what justice is, and the city killed him. So one advantage to writing and teaching in a school, as opposed to going around and talking to everyone, asking everyone questions, and getting yourself sent to the gulag, is or having your head chopped off, is if you write something, it's less public, and for the reader to have access to it, the reader has to choose to read it. In a way, you could say it worked, because Plato lived to be 81 years old. I mentioned he died after writing his longest political dialogue, The Laws. Went to a student's wedding, and then he died a happy old man. Aristotle actually fled Athens because he was about to be charged with atheism. And so he fled, he says, perhaps apocryphal, he says, so that Athens could not sin twice against philosophy. According to tradition and history, he went on back to Macedonia, and Philip II, whose son was Alexander the Great, hired Aristotle as a tutor, etc. So, so the advantage of writing is for Plato, you write complex dialogues, little plays, and what's the good thing? First of all, it protects you from persecution, because, again, as I pointed out about the Republic ends and begins with piety, a religious festival, and some stories about the afterlife. Second, you protect the human life from the potentially destructive and subversive aspects of philosophical questioning. And third, for Plato, you allow each reader to kind of find his or own method without destroying their capacity for moral life, because the reader has to string it together and kind of put, kind of say what your teaching is. For Aristotle, also wrote treatises. They're explicit treatises with books, chapters, and themes, like a textbook. And most students would say, I'd prefer to learn from a textbook, even if it's boring. And you could say that it does also several things. It protects the philosopher from persecution. It still protects the rest of society from philosophy. Aristotle mentions the gods here and there, but he never denies the existence of the gods and everything. And also pose complex problems, but it possesses a firm outside. In other words, you'll see, aside from the question of presentation, I think there is really something profoundly different at work in terms of how the philosopher teaches and speaks to the rest of the non-philosophic world. Plato says, come to me and I'll teach you through complex puzzles the questions you have to ask. And you could still say, well, okay, we learned certain things about justice in the Republic and how to live a personal and collective life. Aristotle would say, come to me, I'll lead you through philosophic awareness of these topics. Also, in some ways, by beginning with opinions. Aristotle doesn't have character speaking, but almost all Aristotle's works start with the common and prevalent opinions about these things. And then ultimately, through Aristotle's rational sifting and definition, he comes to a teaching. But in these treatises, he actually says this is how to do it. So on one level, you could say Aristotle's writing might be drier, it might be less dramatic, less interesting. It's not as much fun as watching Thrasymachus about to get up and thrash Socrates. But you could say it's actually more practical and useful. And Aristotle doesn't presume that everyone's going to have to be a philosopher. And his institutional solution doesn't seem to put philosophers in absolute rule of everything, but rather to have philosophers be professors who write books that actually teach intelligent leaders and citizens how to learn sufficient awareness, not turning them into philosophers, but making philosophy accessible and available to them. So, although you don't have, and I put this in bold in the notes, although you don't have Socrates engaging in dialectical conversation in order to see the idea or the definition behind the different opinions, you actually see the opinions embodied in characters. Aristotle almost always, as I said earlier, starts with the prevalent opinions about human things and then proceeds to formulate a definition. All right. Now, the ethics itself. What kind of a work is the ethics, and what's its arrangements that lead it up to Book 5 on justice? Aristotle, first of all, says the ethics is the first part of a two-part work called the Politics. And indeed, the ethics is called the ethics. It comes from ethike, which means like habits or disposition or character. And politics is the second work. There's actually a work called the Politics. Now, it's interesting. Aristotle says the ethics is the first part of the Politics. Now, on the explicit level, the ethics is about how an individual reaches happiness and goodness and virtue. We'll talk about what those are in a minute. The Politics is how a city does this. Now, you get a whiff of this in Book 5. Book 5 of the Ethics is kind of like a pivotal chapter that links the material in the Ethics, individual virtue and happiness, to the greater work, the Politics, which I've taught many times, which is about how to set up a good city, how to tell good cities from bad cities, and how to be a good leader, and what's the task of a citizen, and etc. So on one level, the ethics is the study of how to attain a moral or virtuous and moral being the same thing for right now, how to be a moral character. Why? Book 1 of the Ethics starts out with saying everything has a purpose, and the highest purpose of everything must be the good, that at which all things aim. That's why you have to kind of go back and see that image of the cone. What the universe wants to be is self-conscious. And that's the completion. And once that happens, you could say the universe is a whole. WHOLE. And that, therefore, the highest of purposes at the end, a chain of purposes, must be the good. And the good, capital G, is that thing, that end to which all things move. So for a human being, Aristotle asks, well, what's the purpose of human life? And again, noting that many people answer that question quite differently. People want different things. They have different ends, different goods. Like what? Some people like money. Some people like sex. Some people like love. Some people like bodily pleasures. Some people like power. Some people like wisdom. Different human beings like lots of things. But here's where Aristotle turns the Ethics into a treatise on human happiness, not unlike we saw in the Republic. Whatever people want, they want it because what they want is a means to an end, and what they really want is happiness. So happiness is that end to which all human beings tend or move. Again, like we saw with Plato, this is an empirical observation, you could say. No human being wants to be unhappy. No, every human being wants to be happy. And then the question is, how do you be happy? Now you're going to see the spoiler is that Aristotle says the only way you can be happy is to be a virtuous human being. It's a kind of a parallel to Socrates' argument in the Republic that if you want to be happy, you've got to be just, and therefore that's how you know the just man is the happiest man. So in a way, the answer in the ethics is virtue. Virtue is the key to being a happy human being. Now, having said that, he knows that also people want other things like children, and money, and sex, and all that kind of stuff, and power. And so in a way, Aristotle wants to create a human world that recognizes multiple ends and yet contains an intelligible principle of order. He wants the human world to possess a certain diversity. It's good for you to want children and money and sex and power. And good looks. But he wants a universe in which there's order or an ability to say how one end or purpose is higher than another. So in a way, Aristotle still thinks that the philosophic way of life is probably the highest way of life. But just because some people want that, everybody's going to need some philosophy in their lives, but not everyone has to be a philosopher. So again, this is, I think, his criticism of Socrates and Plato. We can't go fully into that, and I think that criticism is that Plato over philosophizes the human condition. Aristotle accepts that humanity as they are. We want the practical goods of life, but you need the philosopher to show you what those goods are and what the objective and true and knowledgeable basis of them. Remember, Aristotle's still trying to turn opinion into knowledge. So virtue is the key to being a happy human being, basically. So the purpose of the ethics is to teach you how to be a virtuous human being, what virtue is, and how to get it. Again, the science of human virtue or perfection and happiness is the individual, that's the ethics, and on the collective, that's called the political. So what is the intellectual and moral method by which we can point ourselves towards virtue and shape ourselves into an instrument that embodies virtue and therefore happiness? And you're going to see the key teaching in Aristotle's view of virtue is the mean. And this is a signal of Aristotle, and you'll see it's not only the key to his understanding of the perfection and acquisition of virtue in human life, it's also key to his understanding the different kinds of justice, both in a human being, between human beings, and in a city. So, Book 2 introduces the idea of the internal landscape. We've seen what the external landscape of human life is, the world, universe, nature, and all the stuff we just spoke about. The internal landscape is what do you see when, as a human being? What do you see when you look inside yourself? And what are the things you're made of? And not, again, sodium and chlorine and water, but rather the different parts of your consciousness and functions. The aim of moral virtue is to acquire habits. So you kind of have to see what the end point of virtue is, and then the task of the moral life is to try to, through habituation and acquisition of the good habits of virtue, is to shape yourself like a sculptor that has the moral virtues. How do you do that? First, Aristotle says, you have to look to the extremes of life. And the extremes of life, by the way, are generally the excesses of the irrational parts of our soul. You know, people who are overly fond of sex, that's just like the erotic part of the soul or the bodily part. They want the body's pleasures, and they don't. And yet there's the extreme of people who think that life is splashing yourself on the back and denying you every good thing. So when it comes to fear, for instance, somebody who is afraid of nothing is an idiot, and somebody who's afraid of everything is a coward. So the extremes, Aristotle, I think, says most people can sense them inside you, and I'll just say this and say that for what Aristotle, how do you know when something's an extreme in you? By virtue of whether you feel shame and deprived of freedom, like when you lose your temper or when you eat 4 gallons of ice cream. It's not just that your stomach hurts. When you look at it, you kind of know, I shouldn't have done that. A feel of embarrassment when you give in to the more animalistic parts of your nature. So I think he starts out with the extremes because A, we all can feel them inside and look around us. We can all see people done in by extreme. So vice are the extremes of especially the animal parts of our nature. And the virtue then is you got to kind of aim and get the middle. So as you'll see, through reason, you try to find that middle point, and then constantly, through rational self-scrutiny and discipline, point yourself towards that middle. And that's how Aristotle argues. That's how you turn yourself into a virtuous human being, and also how you turn children into virtuous human beings. So this is an odd mixture of reason and opinion. And probably, if you think about it, easier for most people to attain and understand rather than this complex Platonic soul that we explain in Book 4. It's not that Aristotle doesn't have a concept of the soul, but rather it moves to the background, and what Aristotle wants you to first see is the way you actually experience yourself as a wanting, needing, feeling human being, reacting, locate the extremes, and then chart through reason the middle, and then pull yourself into an imitation of that. The aim is to create a beautiful character, one which is capable of generating a sense of self-perceived honor, not fear of the gods, or fear of punishment after death. This is a secular, objective view of human life, according to Aristotle, and somebody that's not hoping for reward after death. The reward of moral behavior is that sense of freedom and dignity you get when you know you have conquered the irrational elements of yourself, and in some ways risen above the mere animal to the potential for rational self-conscious and governance that is the definition of a human being. The extremes of human behavior lead to slavery and shame, the mean to reason, freedom, and dignity of the self. Books 2 through 4, then, are the beginning of the construction of the moral virtues, starting with the lowest one. The irrational parts of the soul. Aristotle doesn't bother to go into reason versus, eros versus thumos, and etc. He simply kind of makes you aware of your animal passions. Okay, probably the things our body most makes us want are things like bodily pleasure, food, and sex. And so moderation is the first moral virtue. So you have the excess of indulgence and the excess of abstemiousness. You have somebody, like when it comes to food, he says actually the moderation is the extreme between abstemiousness and gluttony. My favorite definition of a glutton is somebody who doesn't so much like the taste of food as the feeling of food going down his throat. That's how Aristotle finds it. So you have two extremes when it comes to bodily pleasure. No pleasure is good. All pleasures are good, and I want as much as I can get. Either one is destructive of human life. So your aim in moderation is to see that middle path, aim at it, and then train your body to attain that rational mean. That's self-governance. When it comes to the next passion, anger and courage, or fear, Aristotle says the extremes are cowardice, in which you're afraid of everything, and foolhardiness, in which you're afraid of nothing and therefore are self-destructive. The mean he calls courage, which is the midpoint between cowardice and foolhardiness. And then through 3 and 4, he takes us up through those two basic and by the way, the same one that Plato talks about, moderation and courage. And ultimately, in Book 4, he teaches us certain social virtues by which we kind of moderate our impulses towards others. And that brings us to Book 5, justice. So our task is to understand his understanding of justice, how justice is a mean both within the human being, between human beings, and just people among each other living under just laws in a just city. And that's where we'll begin our discussion of Book 5.